So our story starts with this right here. So this is a authentic Nazi-manufactured V2 engine. This was what powered the world's first operational ballistic missile, which terrified Antwerp and London throughout the last period of World War II. And it, in the end, ended up being a pretty much useless device as far as military strategy is concerned, because its warhead of only 2,000 pounds was, enough to injure some civilians, but not enough to cause major military achievements. But with the invention of the nuclear warhead, this suddenly changed, and the ability to hurl a invulnerable, or a vehicle that's moving so quickly that it becomes invulnerable to defenses with a unimaginably powerful ordnance on top. It was clear this was a vital element of what was going to be the technological competition that was forming following World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. So when Nazi Germany fell, there were a whole lot of these lying around, and both the Soviets and the Americans were quite interested in this technology, so they collected them as frequently as they could. And both sides ended up evolving the design and turning them into both sides' respective first operational nuclear ballistic missiles. On the US side, that would be the Redstone, which we all know and love, and then on the Soviet side, that would be the R5M. Now, even though both of these missiles were essentially designed off of V2 architecture, and if you look at the engines, it's very clear that these were evolved V2 engines, they were not at all the same missile as far as performance. The Redstone was built as an army missile, essentially to replace certain field artillery systems, and only had a range of 200 miles, which was enough to hit the other side of Germany from Germany. But the R5M was a little bit different. The R5M, despite being based on the same architecture, as I said, was able to reach the United Kingdom from Germany, to reach London and American air bases that were there. So the difference in standoff between the R5M and the Redstone is really what spurred the development of what we'll get to in a second, the Jupiter IRBM. Because you really have to imagine the Cold War as kind of a theoretical quick draw competition. It's not a quick draw competition, it's all about a theoretical quick draw, hopefully, right? And so it's, can my units shoot quick enough and hit far enough to knock out the enemy's shooter before he shoots me, right? And they were not able to do so because these things, like I said, were only able to hit, or rather Redstones were only able to hit targets in Eastern Germany, not in the remainder of the Warsaw Pact, and especially not in the Soviet Union. Whereas R5Ms, based in Eastern Germany, were able to strike France, the United Kingdom, as we said. And so we had to resolve the situation. So in 1956, the same year that both the Redstone and the R5M go into operational service, a requirement is put out by the US Army for an intermediate range ballistic missile to be known as Jupiter. Now, despite being genetically very similar to Redstone, they are physically very different. If you look at Jupiter, you'll notice that unlike Redstone, it has no external control surfaces. Unlike Redstone, it's a little bit shorter, a little bit thicker, more optimized for transportation, either on a truck or in a submarine, turns out. In every way, Jupiter was an improvement on Redstone, and more than any other aspect, that range performance increased stunningly. So Redstone, as we mentioned earlier, has a range of 200 miles, which seems like a lot, but is pretty short as far as ballistic missiles go. So Jupiter took this 200-mile range and extended it to 1,500 miles. So what this meant was Jupiters that were based anywhere in Europe could hit pretty much any target anywhere else in Europe. And this is very important because if the United States wanted to be able to win that quick draw competition, right, and be able to blast the Soviet IRBMs before they were fired, they needed a weapon that would be able to range them. And that's precisely what Jupiter provided, a weapon that could counter-battery enemy nuclear missiles. But there was a problem, which is the Soviets didn't see it that way. So when the United States took to deploying these weapons, they deployed the Jupiters in two locations, Italy and in Turkey. And this wasn't really by choice necessarily. This was the two countries who volunteered to take these missiles because under Eisenhower, the United States was attempting to bind together the nuclear security of the United States and Europe because NATO members were concerned, what if the United States has no stake in Europe? What if the Soviets nuke Europe and the United States just leaves us behind? So what they wanted to do is have a nuclear ability within Europe that could threaten the Soviet Union, and that is precisely what Jupiter's provided. And from Turkey, these weapons would easily be able to hit Moscow or any other major strategic target in Russia besides those that were located much farther out east. But those weren't really a problem to Europe. They were more concerned about the more local stuff. This was pretty innocent. It's a very defensive architecture. It's merely the Europeans wanting to protect themselves and merely the Americans wanting to protect the Europeans, right? To provide that sort of support to the alliance to hold NATO together. But the Soviets saw it as an act of aggression. They saw these Jupiters that were placed in Turkey as the ultimate first strike weapon, and they were right. Because unlike ICBMs and unlike the blunt-nosed Thor, which is over there, these were very fast reactive weapons. Well, we'll take a look in a second at Thor with its blunt reentry vehicle, which was very effective for the level of technology at that time. However, it resulted in a slower than what we would idealize as a reentry speed and allowed it to drift more away from the target, resulting in a longer time to target and less accuracy. Unlike the heat sink reentry vehicle that Thor used, Jupiter used a fancy new ablative heat shield. And rather than just absorbing the heat and creating a shock cone to keep the heat away from the rear of the vehicle, the ablative heat shield just, it doesn't melt, but it breaks away rather than absorbing all that heat. And this allowed a faster reentry and a more accurate attack run. And so because of this, in the year 1959, 1960, 61, and 1962, these were the most accurate missiles in the U.S. Army's inventory, and indeed, well, not the U.S. Army, the U.S. Air Force's inventory, but the U.S. military's inventory in general. And they were very relevant weapons to the Soviets, and they were of grave concern. So the Soviets sought to counter these weapons with an equivalently fast reaction strike force, a quick reaction force, if you will. And they were like, well, there's a problem. See, we, being the USSR, are very close to Europe, but the United States is quite far from Europe. So how are they supposed to threaten the United States with shorter range missiles if the United States is an ocean away? If only there were some communist sympathizers close to the United States. Well, Khrushchev was in luck because there's this man named Fidel Castro, and he was not a great fan of the United States. And he was quite scared of us because we were huge and he was not. So he's approached by Khrushchev, who wants something out of this, and says, hey man, what if I could guarantee you would never be invaded by the United States? That'd be pretty cool, wouldn't it? And Castro was like, that's interesting. Tell me more. And Khrushchev says, well, I've got these fancy things called R-12s and R-14s, and they are strategic ballistic missiles. And if I place them on Cuba, this will help us both out. It will enable me to have a strike ability similar to the Turkish-based Jupiters, and you will have a security guarantee, and the Americans will never be able to invade you. And this seemed like a fantastic idea at the time, but what they did not bet on was John F. Kennedy. And that was a red line for old JFK. And he was not about to deal with this stuff. So upon the realization that the Soviets were moving these medium range and intermediate range missiles to Cuba, JFK put the hammer down and said, listen, this is unacceptable, and I will not allow this to be conducted. And if it is conducted, there will be fatal consequences. And this led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And thankfully, we had two fairly rational individuals in charge, both John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Nikki Khrushchev, right? And they got together and were able to avoid what would have easily been World War III with nuclear weapons, by creating a compromise. The Soviets would take away their R-12s and R-14s from Cuba and all of the nuclear weapons, including bomber-delivered and cruise missile-delivered ones, if the United States were to remove its very spooky Jupiter intermediate-range ballistic missiles from Turkey and from Italy. And this was agreed upon. And so the Cuban Missile Crisis came to a close without any major incident taking place besides that one U-2. But in the end, World War III was avoided, and things were fantastic. And the irony of it was that the Jupiters are going to get retired anyways because they're obsolete as cryogenically fueled mobile missiles, or field missiles as they were, and just would not survive. So they were going to be retired anyways. So really this was not a great loss for the United States at all, and was a huge victory, in fact, because he didn't have to announce doing something in return, and instead it looked like the Soviets were kowtowing to the United States, which would result in problems between Khrushchev and Mao Zedong, right? But that's another very intricate story.